Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to this Fleet Europe webinar supported by Cubic. In this webinar, we will discuss with different experts how to move from cost pressure to cost control and how you and your European fleets can reduce TCO in 2026. You know it better than I do, but fleet costs now move daily, not monthly. EV charging tariffs swing, CO2-based tolls shift, fuel prices fluctuate across different borders, and new e-invoicing rules increase also compliance pressure. CFOs, but also US fleet managers, you can't wait for monthly reports. You need to have real-time insight to prevent overspend, to reduce risk, and also to maintain a good cash flow. If we look a little bit further into fuel volatility, then we see that is adding further strain. For fleets where fuel can already represent up to 40 to even 50% of operating expenses, delayed insight in how, where, and why spend occurs is no longer sustainable. And as we all know, sustainability is paramount for fleet optimization. In this webinar, supported by Cubic, we will cover how European fleets can take real-time control of fleet costs, eliminating blind spots, stopping misuse, and unifying fuel, EV, tolls, and much more without disrupting, of course, your drivers. Welcome again. If you have a question for our expert speakers during the webinar, then please submit your question via the chat function in the tool, because at the end of the webinar, there will be some time to take a couple of questions. Now it's time to introduce our expert speakers for today's webinar. May I welcome Paul Foley, the Commercial Director of In-Payments at Cubic.
Hello.
Hello, Paul. I hope that you are doing well.
Very well, thank you, Stephen. Good to be here.
Yeah, it's nice that you are here. You are not alone. You came with a colleague, also a Paul. So we will have two Pauls in this webinar.
Hello,
My
everyone.
second guest is Paul McCarthy, the lead product manager at Cubic. Good afternoon, Paul.
Good afternoon, Stephen. Thank you. Thank you for having me.
No, it's great.
Names.
Yeah, it's great that you are here. And of course, we also looked for an external expert. And it's my pleasure to introduce to you Mr. Octavian Shelu. He is Advisory Director Mobility at Frost & Sullivan.
Good afternoon, Steve. Hi, everyone.
Hello, Octavian. And thank you for spending some time with Fleet Europe and Cubic and with our audience for, I'm pretty sure, a very valuable webinar. Ladies and gentlemen, you will hear from our three experts. Again, if you have a question for the experts, for one of the experts, you can submit your question via the chat, because at the end there will be time to take a couple of questions. We are going to start with Mr. Paul Foley. Paul, you are going to introduce the topic and also explain a little bit what Cubic can do. So the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you, Stephen. So I'll just give a bit of background on Cubic, and then I'm just going to go back to Octavian just to introduce Frost & Sullivan. But look, I mean, this topic is something that I'm sure you all understand as working in the fleet industry. You know, the world around fleets has become really unpredictable around how to control cost, how to keep a lid on cost pressures, but also around visibility and managing different platforms, managing your vehicles. And particularly this really hot topic around total cost of ownership and how not having visibility of data and not having visibility of your costs can really put pressure on total cost of ownership. But just before I get into that, just quickly about Cubic. So our business is in the connectivity space for software-defined vehicles. So what we do is provide connectivity to mostly in the automotive space, but also in agri and other verticals. Quite simply, we work with the M&O on one side to provide connectivity, and then our customer is the vehicle, is the OEM itself. We provide a platform so they can have real-time controls, software updates, over-the-air updates, and that kind of thing. Started about 10 years ago in Ireland, so our head office is still based here in Dublin, and we've got offices in the US, Spain, Germany. We're about 450 people, and we've about 27 million cars on our platform at the moment, with a goal to have about 100 million by 2030. We work with some of the world's leading OEM brands, and have 12 of the top 20 OEM brands on our platform. So it was kind of a natural progression to kind of for us to move into the fleet space. Before I kind of go into the main topic, Octavian, I might hand it over to you just to give a quick intro of Frost & Sullivan.
Yeah, perfect. Thank you very much, Paul. So I'm going to keep it very, very brief, but just to bring a bit of context of, who is Frost & Sullivan. So if we can have just the overview slide on the screen, it's just basically we are a market research and consultancy company. We exist in a market for over 60 years now. We are present in like 45 plus offices around the world. So we have main teams and main offices on all the continents, basically, in all the big countries. I think what is relevant, and especially with regards to the discussion that we are carrying out today, is you can see the 12 industry areas that we mentioned on the slide, but one of these, of course, is the mobility practice, out of which I'm a part of. And what recommends me for today's session is the fact that I have over 16 years of fleet management, vehicle financing experience within this ecosystem across Europe, North America, and Asia. So we are working within Frost & Sullivan, and I will be detailing a bit later on with some examples, but starting with the market research that I was mentioning about, and then working with clients one-on-one to try to optimize strategies and products and so on. And then also we're taking care of the implementation, of course, as any respectable consultancy business. So that's pretty much in a nutshell about Frost & Sullivan. Back to you, Paul.
Thank you, Octavian. So we might just skip on. Yeah, I've covered some of this already. So yeah, we provide connectivity solutions. So why are we kind of in this space? So if we skip to the next slide, please. So again, with this kind of thing, I mean, I'm sure the audience on the webinar are kind of living and breathing this kind of every day. But from a summary level, costs have accelerated, but the control mechanisms around these costs just have not kept up. Of course, there's fuel and energy volatility. I mean, if we were having this webinar 2 months ago, we still would have said fuel and energy volatility, but of course the geopolitical situation in the Middle East has made this even worse. Not knowing what's going to happen there over the next number of months creates this unpredictable weekly spend and daily spend. So that's been really, really difficult. We're seeing much more in the fleet space, the mixed fleets, so EV charging variants, the hidden cost drift between public charging and home charging, and how do you manage that? Many of the people on this call will have cross-border fleets, particularly in Europe. So this cross-border and CO2 toll reforms, again, bills arriving weeks late. Fleets are having to sort of estimate, predict these bills, and then there's a variance in what actually happens. There's always CFO pressure. All of us have a CFO. I have a CFO. There's always pressure in a business from a cost perspective. And then the e-invoicing rules can be really, really complicated. And there's a compliance risk here and an audit risk here. So all these add to cost pressure in the business. And what we're seeing, the controls and mechanisms to stay across this just have not kept pace with these pressures. So, and look, what does this look like in reality? So what's really important from a driver perspective and a trip perspective, it looks like on a daily basis, we're compliant and we have control over this. So the driver is compliant, the route is valid, and the job is priced correctly. And the job is often priced in a way looking at historical data, but also knowing your fleet and knowing the route. But then, of course, sort of 3 to 5 weeks later, the bills arrive in. There might be an unexpected toll adjustment. And this can add, our research is showing us, talking to fleet managers, this can often be 50 to 60 euros per trip. And if we take sort of 4 trips a week over the course of a year, there can be a 10K margin reduction per vehicle per year. Now, you guys all know the size of your fleets, but if you sort of multiply that up and times the amount of vehicles per year, you can really, really see the cost impact of not having clarity around these mechanisms. So what's been happening? So visibility is just lagging behind. So before this year, we kind of had monthly reports, reconciliation, and this was okay because we had stable costs and kind of retrospective reporting. But now this kind of daily swings in fuel prices and costs, the fragmentation is increasing, and more there's these blind spots, and it lacks this real-time control that fleet managers are looking for. And the frustrating thing on this, and when we speak to fleet managers, and they're all saying the same thing, this leakage is absolutely predictable, but it's continuous. So whilst we're predicting it's happening, it keeps happening. Again, EV charging, we're seeing these mixed fleets where commercial vehicles want to use public charging, but they also might charge at base, or they might charge at home. And how do you kind of split out those tariffs? There's often off-route fueling, so you might have certain commercial agreements with your fuel provider, but often drivers might not use those particular fuel providers, or they're using premium stations or premium fuel when they shouldn't be. Driver behavior, detours and idling, or price blind decisions. And then the last two pieces are kind of linked. So this kind of issue with foreign exchange fees, VAT reclaim, and then the sort of manual reconciliation or missing receipts that often happen with each trip. And this is causing a huge admin headache. So there's a mix here of real costs and real issues, but also the hidden costs and the hidden labor-intensive manual reconciliation that often has to happen to get full clarity on this. And look, why is this happening? This is not happening because of people doing a bad job of this, or drivers not being compliant. The core issue here is the blind spot on the data. There's not enough visibility. And this is driven a number of reasons, sort of bad systems, not integrated systems, different vendors, no way to kind of aggregate all this kind of information. And this leaves gaps in your data, and this creates a huge fraud risk. And also, I'm sure what you are all experiencing is a really costly manual overhead to reconcile this data kind of on a monthly basis. And this overhead builds up, and this data builds up, and again, there's increased blind spots as the fleet starts to grow, as vendors start to grow, and as cost pressures continue to increase. And what does this mean? Well, this is kind of the key point here. I mean, the total cost of ownership has become kind of a real-time problem. And I'm not going to go into all the detail here, but this is slightly different across each of the verticals. So haulage, cross-border fueling variants, as we've already touched on, the foreign exchange fees, delivery, sort of multi-driver misuse. So if one vehicle has been used by multiple drivers, again, that's really, really difficult to manage. Corporate, there's compliance pressures, and then mobility, municipal, there can be issues around identity link fraud and user fueling misuse. Again, all adding to this increasing pressure on total cost of ownership. So, and what often happens is, and we've a bit of experience looking at fleet managers doing this. So to be absolutely clear, and I've touched on this, the fleet managers are completely aware that this is happening, and they are leaning into trying to fix this problem. And what's been happening is that managers have been sort of building internal tools, so in custom integrations across fuel, EV, toll, service networks. They've tried to extend car telematics and reporting tools, and then layering in manual rules, alerts, reconciliation processes. We've seen AI being used a bit, kind of in its infancy in this space, but again, very labor intensive. And what actually is really, really happening is this can often make the issue a lot worse. So any new platform constantly needs to be upgraded, and there's a manual overhead with that. There's a growing compliance burden. Fraud models, they're good kind of at a point in time, but as kind of fraud activity increases or becomes smarter, those models have to be updated. And then the responsibility for VAT disputes and VAT evidence and audit kind of still remains in-house. So all your compliance obligations still remain, and often a new system, whilst built in good faith and trying to manage these issues, can often make this a lot worse. So we are seeing a real desire from fleet managers to stay across these issues. These issues are really well known, but often the way we've been doing it in the past just is making this a bit more of an issue. So, Taven, I'm going to hand back to you.
Yeah, perfect. Thank you very much, Paul, for this detailed overview. So we saw Paul just basically highlighting the operational struggle with regards to what is currently happening in the market. What I would like to do over the next 2 minutes is just widen the lens a bit more and provide you with our own understanding based on the discussions with, of course, fleet service provider, fleet managers alike on what basically is happening. And every time we carry such a discussion within all the major participants, there are pretty much the same three, let's call them tensions, that keep surfacing over and over and over again. And you can see them listed on the screen today. And I just want to briefly touch upon each of these. But starting with number one, which is basically the speed of change versus the speed of adaptation. So the industry is changing faster than fleet organizations can absorb. And I think this is something that we should be very mindful of when we discuss about all these changes on everything that is currently happening. And this happening consists in, for example, EVs and digitization and the implementation of AI and residual value risk dynamics and so on and so forth. So, and all of these, they do not happen one after the other. They pretty much hit all of them at the same time. But to put a number behind it, and this comes from our research, you can see it in red on the screen, is basically, according to our own research at Frost & Sullivan, the in-vehicle AI market alone, it's estimated to go from roughly $43 to $238 billion by 2030. So that's roughly a 40% compound annual growth rate. Now, if you look at the fleet ecosystem, and if you look at the fleet team, for example, you are going to see the same headcount, the same processes, the same monthly reporting cycle as roughly 5 years ago. So while the technology is sprinting, the organization is walking, if you can put it in such terms. So the gap is where decisions get delayed and money gets lost. And I believe that's the core of the discussion today. If we look at the second tension, cost versus electrification versus sustainability. So I just mentioned, everything tends to happen at the same time. Fleet managers today are being asked to optimize the three things at once. So when you look at cost, electrification, and sustainability, but the issue comes with the fact that these three, they pull pretty much in different directions. So buying EVs, it means more costs upfront because EVs are going to be more expensive. Hitting sustainability targets means accepting infrastructure constraints depending on the region, the country that your fleet mainly activates. Cutting costs hard means slowing electrification. So the data tells a different story. As you can see, 88% of the fleets have a top priority with regards to costs. Sustainability is being evaluated by 24% of them, and roughly 47 have sustainability goals under review. Now, you can see that these are pretty much not on the same line, which brings additional complexity of what is happening, and at the end of the day, of where the decision should lie. Which should you pick? Which should you prioritize in order to make sure that you align a good functioning of the fleet, a good ecosystem, and of course with everything regarding to cost control, reducing costs, aligning with the company's sustainability targets. And the third one, which we see rising more and more as we speak, and especially with this topic of AI and electrification that should be implemented widely, and I'm going to limit myself only to the European region, but you do see basically the international fleets that are being affected the most on this. You cannot run a single policy that is going to be valid throughout Europe because of the different EV infrastructure, the tax treatment, the regulations, the market maturity, and there can be a wide variety of reasons why not. The example that I have for this on the screen and the complexity of it, it comes from ACEA. It's only with regards to the BEV registrations in January of 2026. And you can see, for example, different countries like France and Germany, this powertrain is growing. The Netherlands all of a sudden is declining, and the same in Belgium. And if you look at it, this is not to really assess the electrification into detail, but it's more telling the story of how different the markets are and the fact that you need as a fleet to try to find that unified way of making it work, to try to optimize the costs across this varied environments and so on. So to pull all of this together, Cubic already highlighted a real problem. The harder truth is that most fleets don't have the clarity or the structure to act on this consistently. So the tooling matters, yes, but only when the strategy underneath is clear. Back to you, Paul. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I think Paul McCarthy.
Yeah, it's over to me. Thanks, Octavian. Thanks, Paul. So to really look at the total cost of ownership and being a real-time problem in the market for fleet managers and for fleet companies, the operating model really has to keep up with that particular topic, okay? Fleets today can't manage through all the various tools that are actually designed for retrospective reporting, whether that's a fragmented system that will exist through your fuel supplier, whether it's an EV charging supplier, or whether it's tolling, or any of the actual services that exist in the actual industry. You're dealing with back office inefficiencies that exist in the particular market, okay? So what we require in the market is effectively a model that aligns with the cost control and how the actual fleets will operate using that particular system, right? So you want to keep it in line with that business model and effectively working across cross-border functions, mobile, live services effectively. And it's about changing where the control sits in the whole overall process, okay? Shifting it towards the moment the transaction actually occurs in the actual, in the vehicle. And we'll talk through that shift in that business model going forward. Okay, so what does the operating model actually look like in practice? So we believe that at its core, it should be a shift to context-aware payments, okay? So what we see today is effectively fleet management companies and fleet payments are authorized on very limited information across the business. So typically you'll have drivers using card with PINs and effectively transaction amounts. You'll have paper transactions, receipts, and there's no real understanding for the fleet managers of who's driving that vehicle, where it actually is in the actual location, and whether the transaction actually makes sense across what they're actually doing on the job at that time, okay? So context-aware payments effectively are going to change and revolutionize that particular space. So what we believe is that a transaction should only be approved when the vehicle, the driver, the location, the time, and the policies are all aligned. If one of the elements don't match up, effectively what we're seeing is that the payment simply won't go through. And that's really about maintaining that authorization layer above the actual services, okay? So this is where the control shifts and where the control actually happens, and trying to fix problems retrospectively for fleet managers becomes an administrative headache for everybody. So realistically, it's with this business model, it's to shift the actual context and shift the control to the moment that the spend actually occurs. So importantly, in this overall context, the requirement is not for fleet managers and companies to rip out current suppliers, current contracts that are actually in place with various fuel companies, EV charging, and different services, or change actual driver behavior, okay? Drivers will still fuel, charge, and park as normal across their day-to-day business. But having one intelligent payment layer that's sitting across all of the different existing suppliers and networks brings visibility, brings control, brings policy enforcement, and also, importantly, audit-ready records for reconciliation after the fact. So the critical point is visibility becomes immediate, okay? Misuse is also prevented at source, so effectively we're not seeing any fraud in that particular industry. And then cost control finally operates at the same speed as the fleets operate themselves, okay? The day-to-day life and what we're good at in that particular industry is to move goods across the European and across the globe. So what's that operating model look like, and where do benefits actually pop out of that? So once we see that payments are actually carrying real context, you see a fundamental shift and a fundamental change in the whole industry. Visibility stops being descriptive and starts becoming really actionable. So instead of estimating jobs, estimating routes, or estimating costs for particular jobs, what we believe that the authorization layer sitting above those particular services will offer is fully itemized billing and reporting across all services that are actually offered in the industry, whether that's fueling, charging, parking, tolls, and everything else in between. So what that actually creates is effectively, it will have direct operational impact for the fleet companies. Excuse me. So for drivers, what it supports is better route selection, is optimization through their actual journeys, making sure that cost differences are managed and no longer hidden for those particular drivers. So there's no unforeseen costs popping up. For fleet managers, it enables faster, more accurate margin planning across the spend for their entire fleet. And for commercial teams, it also improves rebid pricing. It also improves transaction history, real data, real-time data, not on average basis or estimates. It's actual real-time and very forecastable. So where this really matters is that in this entire industry, obviously margins are extremely tight, especially with the global economy as it is today. We see that fuel and energy represent a massive portion of any operating cost for any particular business. So decisions based on incomplete or unverified data can create real risk in the industry. Just as importantly, then the level of transparency changes the internal conversations. Decisions become evidence-based. When we have this authorization layer and visibility to all of the fleet managers, you're not becoming reactive. You are evidence-based. So what does that look like then once we have the level of visibility, the advantages that we actually become true? Okay, so once fleets, and we believe that once fleets have this level of visibility, negotiation strength becomes extremely strong. Okay, when we have the fragmented spend across the industry, whether that's through cards, fueling companies, fueling contracts, EV charging contracts, and tolling, it's difficult for fleet managers to go negotiate from a position from uncertainty. So having this visibility layer and this control element across across the fleet, unified visibility completely changes the dynamic altogether. So effectively, with this authorization layer and this visibility layer, effectively you're seeing all transaction coming in, regardless of the services. You're bringing into one platform that you can actually, in real time, see that particular data, so you can strengthen your negotiation strengths with any of those particular suppliers. So to give an example, we could say that a fleet manager would say, with that level of uncertainty, we know we do business with you, but we cannot identify the exact volume or the amount of transactions or locations in particular areas at any given time. So exposing that to the fleet managers effectively will give that control and also give that negotiation power to actually challenge all of those suppliers to really better your cost management and reduce your overheads and increase your savings. So if we look, and if you could move slide there. So beyond the pricing and the actual the unified control over that particular solution, okay, what we look at then is efficiency for the fleet managers and having real tangible operational benefits for the actual fleet managers themselves. So as we discussed previously, there's a fragmented service layer that exists in the industry today across fueling, charging, parking, and other services. And effectively what that does for our back office teams is the administrative headaches of looking at particular invoicing and various different supplier contracts, different terms and conditions for those particular contracts. So that doesn't add value for the administrative teams that exist in the fleet management teams, chasing receipts, resolving discrepancies, and correcting VAT issues, for example. So effectively, with having that authorization layer and also the visibility layer, it really benefits the fleet managers to reduce the time because you're receiving all of the single invoicing layers into one platform. So we believe that creating this efficiency for back office management, effectively we've seen in the industry some benchmarks that we can see almost 50% or more reduction in payment administration and reconciliation workload. That's simply because everything is pulling into one single platform and one single portal to actually benefit that particular fleet manager. Reconciliation for month end becomes approximately 60% faster. And we've also seen studies of for invoice processing cycles also improving by almost up to 80% faster processing times. So the real value then for these particular companies and fleet companies is capacity, okay? So when teams spend less time fixing problems in the industry and doing reconciliation issues, they gain to monitor exceptions, okay? You can forecast costs and manage spend proactively. This also benefits in terms of dealing with your CFOs, for example, and making sure that your month-end reconciliations are closed in a much faster and more seamless manner. Okay, so realistically, it's natural to ask what this operational model would look like in practice and how do fleets actually implement that particular solution, okay? This is where Fleet Wallet realistically fits into the picture. Fleet Wallet isn't just another card application. It's not just another EV charging app. It's not just another tolling application. It's designed as a unified payment layer that sits above all of the networks and services that fleets are already using in the industry today. The role it plays is very specific. It enables context-aware payments in practice. It links every transaction, whether it's fueling, charging, tolling, parking, to the vehicle, the driver, and to the job, right at the moment that it actually happens. Because of this and the benefits that we've discussed previously, real-time visibility, proactive control, faster reconciliation, and cleaner data aren't theoretical anymore. They're not paper-based. They're not chasing after invoicing. They become operational. Importantly, as I discussed previously, it doesn't require fleets to change their current supply base and disrupt their drivers on a day-to-day basis. Okay, we don't want to change that particular workflow for those particular drivers and for the fleet managers, for example. What changes is what happens behind the scene. Okay, fragmented payments are unified, context is added automatically, and control moves, importantly, as I mentioned, to the front of the process, right at the point of transaction. So in the next few slides, we'll look at what this looks like in real practice for the drivers, both the drivers and the fleet managers themselves. Okay, sorry, we just skipped one. So we start for the driver. So effectively what we want to, from the driver's perspective, the key point is simplicity. We do not want to break that particular workflow for that particular driver, managing multiple cards or managing new processes, okay? In the example that's showing on screen at the moment, the driver selects an en route station, and effectively they would normally, effectively what the system is actually providing is when the vehicle arrives at the particular fueling station, the system recognizes that the vehicle has hit that particular location. The pump unlocks from a specific vehicle. There is no plastic card, no pins, and no manual payment setup. Effectively, that gives the driver a real efficiency that they do not have to enter the particular store, so they can continue on their journey, really reducing that time and effort on a particular route for the drivers. And at the same time, as the video went through there, effectively a digital VAT receipt is immediately created in real time back to the dashboard for the fleet management company. So from a driver's point of view, effectively, it's really a simplified method for the drivers to unlock the pump remotely, and effectively it becomes a simpler process in terms of handling those actual physical cards that they have to enter stores. You may have multiple physical cards in your actual cockpit, for example. So no additional admin after the fact, no receipts, no paper receipts, no loss, no forms filling, no delays. Okay, that's how the model works in practice for the drivers, so they stay focused on the job while payment, validation, and documentation happens in the background. Next slide, please. Okay, so let's look at what the same transaction looks like for the fleet manager in the back office perspective, okay? So as soon as the transaction happens, it is appearing in the dashboard in real time. There's no waiting for paper files that come after the fact, no additional emails to deal with, no manual uploads, and no dependency on month-end statement, end-of-month statements, okay? So each transaction arrives fully context ready, as I mentioned previously, already attached. The vehicle, the driver, the location and timestamp, and the policy that was introduced by that particular company is that it was all validated against. That means that drivers can immediately see not just what was spent, but why it was valid and where it actually happened. From a control point of view, this is where things really change. Fleet managers can set those spend caps, they can restrict fuel types, they can identify fraud at the point of transaction, define the preferred suppliers by country, receive alerts for anomalies, volume spikes, duplication transaction, fraudulent spend. For finance teams, this also is a great benefit as well. Reconciliation becomes straightforward. Transactions are already structured and matched exactly in that particular platform. You can dedicate particular fuel cards to particular drivers and vehicles, which is really benefiting with that single invoice after the fact across all of your services that exist in the industry, whether that's fueling, charging, parking, tolling, they all exist in one platform. Instead of reacting weeks later and having to retrospectively go through invoicing and trying to match any anomalies in that particular solution, there's fewer exceptions, there's less admin, you're more efficient in practice and far more confidence in the numbers that you're working with. The next slide, please. So let's zoom out a little for a second, maybe on the individual transaction. And this is where the real shift actually becomes clear. For fleet managers, this is not about gaining another dashboard or payment tool. Effectively, most companies are very familiar with dealing with fragmented tools looking after multiple different platforms and services. And realistically, having this with Fleet Wallet effectively is pulling that all into one aggregated layer to manage that particular visibility, that payment control. And this is where control is actually applied. As we mentioned previously, instead of reviewing spend after the fact, effectively it's moving the control to the front of the process. Transactions, as we mentioned, are managed and validated in real time. Policy is enforced, and visibility is instant through notification processes, through live reporting, through various anomaly detections. This is all brought to the front exactly in your dashboard for the fleet managers. And again, keeping that simplicity for the drivers as well. So what does that enable? Effectively, we get consistency across the entire fleet, the same rules for the drivers, vehicles, suppliers, and countries. And effectively, exceptions can stand out immediately instead of being buried in reporting and after the fact discovery. For finance and compliance teams, reconciliation becomes much more linear rather than a forensic exam for those particular fleet managers. So as we mentioned, it's one invoice, it's one single VAT flow, and a complete audit trail is available by default. This is why we really describe this whole particular platform and this authorization layer and visibility layer as a real gear shift in the actual industry. Not because of adding complexity, but fundamentally changing how the balance between effort and control is there. Please spend less time chasing problems and the fact that more time managing by exception in real time. At this point, I think I hand back to Paul. Thank you.
Thanks, Paul, for bringing us through that. So I suppose we're going to kind of finish this up by kind of talking about a real world impact, a real world example that we currently work with. So if we skip on to the next slide, please. So, we've gone through a lot of this already, but what are the summary of the key problems? Inefficiency, fraud, operational burden, right? So, missing fuel cards, drivers paying out of pocket. And this is a real client we've worked with. Manual reconciliation at head office, slow reimbursement. So you've got drivers, using their own card to pay for things and having to get reimbursed and so on. And just the administrative overhead of kind of those first two items is really, really high. And that's often a cost that is just not captured kind of in the right way. And then the spikes in fuel fraud, no real-time verification, spikes in fuel pricing, and so on. And with the fraud piece, that's one of the key features of Fleet Wallet and this unified payment layer, as we can stop this fraud at source, and that's really, really important. So, stop it before it happens, and again, that saves a huge amount of money for fleets. Next slide, please. So look, what were the results of implementing Fleet Wallet? So, they were real and tangible. 20% drop in unauthorized out of policy spend, 10% plus savings from eliminating fuel fraud and misuse. And you all know your own fuel bill. So imagine kind of cutting out 10% of that. Again, our market research tells us that across Ireland, UK, and Europe, up to 10% of a fleet's fuel bill can be fraud. So eliminating that at source as opposed to retrospectively, again, much better and really, really good for cash flow. And then the 50% reduction in the administrative workload, again, often a hidden cost, but definitely a real cost, particularly for the people working in your business. And then the 100% visibility on route costing, margin protection, and know exactly where drivers are fueling and their behavior. And then a really important piece that we're hearing from all fleet managers is the audit-ready documentation, vehicle verified, again, reducing such an administrative workload and heavy lift every month and every quarter and every year. And, the measurable impact was, sort of $250,000 in estimated annual savings on a full fleet of this particular size. So again, real cost savings, hidden cost savings, and a real tangible outcome when using Fleet Wallet. So why partner with them something like Fleet Wallet? Well, it kind of removes, again, the heavy lift around creating your own systems. There's no platform upgrades or internal overhead. There's built-in regulatory compliance across all markets. I've talked about this already, but the centralized fraud prevention and control logic is already built in and can also be adapted to your fleet as well. And it scales right across EU-wide and other markets. Fast rollout without custom development. We do our own development and we'll roll out those upgrades out to our customers and look lower total operational burden over time. So what it does is give you this scale of compliance overnight and reduces all the complexity, gives you visibility, and reduces the administrative burden as well instantaneously. So how can you take action? Well, we'd love to discuss Fleet Wallet a bit more with everyone on the call, but adopting unified multi-supplier spend. So, again, it's one API, it's one integration with Fleet Wallet, and it gives you access to all these services. Faster end-of-month reconciliation. Paul talked about the numbers, real-time visibility, and look, what's really important as well in a time when there is unpredictability, complexity, and sort of variance around cost, and being confident around cost per route, per driver, per vehicle, per job, is something that our fleet customers are finding really, really beneficial. So the key takeaways. This isn't changing. Cost pressures are continuing to increase. Volatility is increasing. Complexity is increasing. Rules are changing constantly. So visibility is really, really important. So clear visibility of what's happening with your drivers, but also real-time, instantaneous, contextual visibility, I think is a key piece that Fleet Wallet brings. It also gives you this control in a world where, again, increasing complexity you might seem out of control. this unified payment layer like Fleet Wallet can actually bring back control into your business, particularly around fraud and variance. And then also the scale. On this call, I'm sure we have fleets from 100 vehicles right up to tens of thousands. So the great thing about Fleet Wallet, it kind of scales instantly with your business, matches the size of your business. And as your fleet grows, so will Fleet Wallet and the services, and as additional services needed, we add them on as your fleet will need those. So Stephen, thank you everyone. I think I'm going to head back to Stephen for the Q&A.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Paul and Octavian. Thank you very much for sharing the insights and the expertise, and also bringing to attention how you can master the uncertainty when it comes to total cost of ownership in an international setup. As mentioned at the start of this webinar, we will start with our Q&A session. So to the participants, if you have questions or remarks or comments, then please share it in the chat so that I can take a couple of questions for our expert speakers. And I wanted to start with the people from Cubic, with Paul and Paul. If I understand correctly, you are saying that still today, many fleets are quite reactive when it comes to cost control, to controlling their spend and so on, and that also that they don't have real-time visibility on all the spend and all the volumes and all the details of their fleet as it should and could be.
Yeah, I think
sorry. And the question is, do you think that the acceleration of technology and AI could bring value in gaining visibility for fleet managers?
Yeah, so I think, so just in terms of a couple of parts of that question, I think different fleets in different markets will have different technologies, right, to manage cost and spend. I think a larger fleet may have, possibly better systems because they just have more investment. But added to that, they have more complexity in their fleet because they have larger fleets and they have more markets and more routes, more drivers, and so on. So, and often larger fleets have kind of built up sort of multiple systems that have kind of been bolted onto different systems, and that kind of make things quite complex. So I think there's a mixed. If you went out and surveyed 1,000 fleets, you'd probably find mixed visibility around cost control, and often it can be quite reactive, and often. As I said in the presentation, the fleets know this is happening, but it's how they're reacting to it. The AI question is really relevant because more and more we're adding AI features into Fleet Wallet, which will allow for more accurate, predictive visibility over spend over time. So when you work with the fleet, you'll get to know them much better. You'll get to understand their driver behaviors, their vehicles, the types of vehicles, their fueling, and so on. So then we'll be able to say to a fleet, well, we think over the next week, month, year, we can say to a pretty high using AI, and this is what we think your cost pressures are going to be, notwithstanding external shocks and those kind of things that can also come in. But yes, AI, I think, really, really adds an additional feature and reduces complexity and visibility of data kind of over time.
Maybe just I'll add to that, Paul, in terms of the technology advancements, and it's not just in the AI space, right? I think in the whole mobility space and the connectivity space, and actually using telematics units and the smart units in the actual industry. Okay, so you're now getting down to even a deeper authorization layer when we talk about actual SIM authorization and making sure that actual vehicles are being authorized to go through tolling, for example, and it's kind of in the space of the V2X, for example, right? So I think the industry is accelerating at a rate of knots. I think AI, as Paul has mentioned quite distinctly, in terms of having that predictability, having that visibility, and managing control, managing trends, managing future spend, I think is going to be massive in terms of the enhancement of that particular industry for fleet managers. And effectively what that creates is a simplicity layer as well for the actual fleet managers, okay? The simplification of that is optimization, it's efficiency layers that we really actually experience. So I think, yes, the industry is definitely going to continue to shift with that whole mobility embedded in telematics units, or whether it's third-party aftermarket telematics units after the fact. I think that whole technology layer is pushing forward, which is really going to shift to more simplicity for fleet managers and drivers, really taking control of that particular industry. So I think that's something that we're focusing on, especially in our particular space as well, in trying to match all of those different technologies to bring it into one kind of simplified single layer.
Okay. Octavian, based on also your findings, I wanted to know, and perhaps I'm a little bit severe and strong for the fleet managers, but do you see them as quite, let's say, conservative when it comes to how they operate their fleets, how they operate the processes and controlling costs, and that there is a need for more an innovative mindset, a little bit more disruption?
Yeah, I mean, I do understand where you're coming from, Stephen, and while I do understand also the being maybe strong worded towards the fleet managers, what we do see is that fleets are investing. So it's not like they are not doing anything, but I think there is quite an important aspect to understand, and that would be that, for example, they are focusing on existing processes. So they are focusing on how can we improve what we already have. And this can only take you so far, up to the point on which you do need to look at the new technology. So we were just discussing about AI and so on. And usually you cannot implement all of these different technologies that are coming at a very fast pace, as I was mentioning earlier, by using legacy platforms, legacy services, and so on and so forth. So that's why I believe that's where the discrepancy lies currently in the market, is to understand the fact that, yes, it's good to try to optimize the systems that we have, but also to know when to recognize the limitation of those systems and when we need to basically make a step ahead and try to adopt new technology. So while you do see an increasing adoption of, telematics and fleet management software, which are expanding at quite high rates, we still need to properly invest and implement the brand new technologies that are helping us improve everything from operations to costs within the fleets.
Okay. And we are operating, of course, in different markets across Europe and sometimes even beyond Europe. Yeah. We heard already that many of us rely on monthly reporting, quarterly reporting, and that with the technology that exists and the solutions like Cubic can offer, that also real-time reporting and control is possible. So, but still we are doing things a little bit in the old way. Is this something that you see across multiple markets, and can you understand why fleets are still using those monthly or quarterly reportings?
Yeah, so it's pretty much linked to the previous point that I had. So just to start with the first part of your question, Stephen, yes, we do see this as well, and quite consistently, to be honest with you. And we believe it's not a small problem, but it's actually structural and it's growing. And what I mean by this lag between when a cost actually happens and when finance can see it is too wide for how fast the rules are changing. So if you look at, for example, cross-border tolls, typically they land somewhere between 3 to 5 weeks after a trip has been taken place. Fuel and charging, anywhere from few days to a couple of weeks, depending on billing cycles and whatnot. By the time the numbers are on the books, the trip is already long done, completed, and so on. And on top of it, the environment also makes it harder. So you have new toll regimes that are coming into force across multiple EU markets this year alone. CO2-linked tolling is spreading fast. E-invoicing mandates are rolling out country by country, and so on. So the cost rules themselves are moving faster than monthly cycles can absorb. So this brings me to one of those problems that I was highlighting earlier on my slide, and that's the the action and reaction to that action, which currently we see in the majority of the cases takes way too much time in order to start using words as optimum or optimizing costs. So you cannot optimize costs when you have access to understanding the costs and the impact on your budget only weeks after that cost happens. So that's basically where Cubic, where their solution, I think, can really help with, narrowing down this time and really support fleets with acting almost immediately.
So, Paul Foley, is that correct? That your fleet wallet is doing exactly that and taking away that burden and those hurdles that Octavian just described?
Yeah, so if you imagine, often a typical fleet has multiple supplier relationships, multiple payments happening. So even the very fact that you're sort of consolidating that into one system, so it's one integration with us, and then we integrate from a supplier vendor side, and then consolidating all of that into one single platform. And I think Octavian's point around sort of real-time visibility around payment is super key, right? So you will know today what the driver has spent, this isn't. I mean, cash flow and predictability and visibility of spending. I mean, that's a issue and a need for every business, not just in the fleet world. So the ability to kind of see this in real time, predict cash flow, and kind of see what we're spending, is super important.
Going to the other Paul, let's imagine that there is a fleet that is using Fleet Wallet, that is also really in favor of, wherever possible, controlling the spend and all the data in real time. What is then the first concrete issue they tend to uncover when they go into that more detailed in real time, reporting?
I suppose the first thing that we're generally seeing is inconsistency where the expected uniformity is actually supposed to exist, okay? So whether that's on the same routes that the drivers have been driving through consistently, it's the same jobs, same types of policies, but we're seeing spikes or dips in the spend and management of that particular job. You're seeing that level of inconsistency, and effectively they're expecting uniformity. Okay, so what does that do? It's predictability for the actual fleet managers in terms of their spend, in forecasting jobs, in bidding for particular jobs, for example. I think that's probably the main item that we're seeing as the most kind of common trait that we're seeing across the industry. Right. So again, it's creating that inconsistency layer when you expect uniformity. That's realistic.
When I talk to international and global fleets, you can have, of course, a regional fleet manager for Europe, and you have a regional lead for the Americas, or you even have a global fleet manager. But of course, they are not alone. There are quite some people that are working in that team, and then even cross-functional. There is HR, there is finance, there is operations, etc. I can imagine that also the topic of manual processes and overload and the cost of that is something that many fleets probably underestimate, that they perhaps have the idea, well, we are doing pretty well, but once that they are going to use a solution like Fleet Wallet, that they will see what kind of benefits and gains can be realized. Is that correct, Paul?
Yeah, I would believe that most fleets are underestimating the actual level of effort that goes into this. I think if we all look at our own day-to-day lives in terms of doing the manual effort of, reconciling invoicing, reconciling, whether that's Excel-based files, for example, or digital or physical receipts, the manual effort and timing that goes into that. We definitely see that with fleet management, and it is underestimated in terms of how much effort goes into that particular space. I think we've seen advancements, obviously, with AI in the whole industry, in our daily lives, and how that's improved efficiencies across the board. And effectively that's what we're trying to expose and facilitate our fleet managers with Fleet Wallet as well, okay, is to actually reduce that level of complexity and manual spend and manual time spent on particular processes for those fleet managers. So yes, I do believe it's a true statement. It's often much greater operationally, and actually providing this in terms of a platform and reporting capability, increasing those efficiencies massively.
Okay. Paul Foley, we just already touched upon the fact that in such a role, the fleet manager can never be alone. Do you think that at one moment this topic should also be addressed, let's say, to other categories within the company and probably even to the finance division and the CFO?
Yeah, so I mean, what we're finding when we speak to fleet managers, often the second meeting involves the head of finance or the CFO, right? I mean, quite quickly, particularly when you're talking about cost saving. You know, I mean, the immediate, most obvious cost saving we discussed was the fuel fraud piece. So, you know, imagine you all know your own, for the fleet managers on the call, you all know your own fuel bills, and we're estimating 10% of that is fraud. So you could cut that out overnight. I mean, that's music to most CFOs' ears, right? So they're super interested in this. But also from anyone involved in efficiency, procurement, anyone around the business is really, really interested in this, particularly around, so the immediate cost saving, there's the management of suppliers again, but there's also like how your people in your business are doing tasks that they don't need to be doing, because this can be automated through something like Fleet Wallet. So I think it's of interest to a lot of people in fleet businesses.
Okay. A couple of questions to end on Cubic and on Fleet Wallet. First of all, if I'm the fleet manager of a European-wide fleet, where do we start? Do I contact you? How long is the implementation process? What is needed exactly from my organization and my drivers? Can you briefly explain?
Yeah, well, from a contact perspective, I mean, it just contact us directly. I think our details are in the presentation. So, and we can move quite quickly in terms of, obviously, the questions will be around your telematics, size of your fleet, and where you have the most demand, and where you're operating. You know, we consider ourselves a pretty agile business. We set up Fleet Wallet to be something quickly that can be rolled out very, very fast. So, you know, we'll move quickly once we have a discussion with you. And, you know, the way we do this is we often do a trial on a certain part of your fleet to make sure it's working, you get what you needed, and then we kind of go from there. And from an implementation perspective, I'll hand over to Paul in terms of getting a feel for that one.
Thanks, Paul. So realistically, we can onboard new clients in a rapid manner, right? So realistically, when we talk to any of the fleet managers, you'd also be talking to maybe the telematics manager as well. That would actually be in that particular business. So realistically, we can get you up and running very, very quickly, as Paul has indicated, in a matter of days, for example. And effectively for drivers, then it just becomes a seamless app download for the drivers, which is enabled obviously by the fleet manager in the actual dashboard itself. So that becomes effectively controllable, and you can be live within a matter of days with Fleet Wallet across the European footprint at this moment in time.
Okay. A question, of course, that I need to ask in terms of the business model, of the cost model for the customers. Is it like that you, as a fleet manager, you pay sort of a subscription, or is it like a fixed fee that needs to be paid? How is it working?
Yeah, so it's the way we work it is a per vehicle per month fee. And, you know, we can stand behind that, I think, because we know the immediate cost savings from a fuel perspective. But, you know, we sort of look at that, we sort of flex that up and down depending on volume, size, guaranteed vehicles we're going to put on the platform, and so on. So that is the model. We generally charge per month per vehicle.
Okay. Is it for all types of fleets? Big, small, passenger car vehicles, LCVs, trucks, everything?
Yep. We do not distinguish. You know, there's some nuances in there in terms of different needs and sort of fueling events and that kind of thing, and how the app might interact. But again, we built it in a way that, I mean, all these problems we talked about are across all fleets. They're exaggerated in some sectors as opposed to others. But Fleet Wallet is for every single commercial fleet. It does not matter what size the fleet is.
Okay. And then the final one, in terms of geographical presence and expansion. So I think that you are already well embedded throughout Europe. Anywhere else, any other regions or expansion plans that you can share with our audience?
Yeah, well, I suppose, going back to the DNA of Cubic, we're in 200 countries and territories. So wherever Cubic is, Fleet Wallet is. And we focused on Europe. That's kind of our home market, and that's where we sort of the biggest issue. But we're really interested in talking to fleets in other markets, and we can light up and roll out Fleet Wallet where we see demand.
Perfect. Thank you very much. Thank you for your expertise and your insights. Thank you, Paul, and also Octavian. To the participants, if you want to learn more about the topic, if you want to learn more about Fleet Wallet, or you want to be in contact with our experts of Cubic, then please scan the QR code so that you know how to master your TCO with the support of technology in 2026 and even beyond. Thank you very much. Thank you for your attention, and I hope to see you in an upcoming Fleet Europe webinar.